Okay, I'm Chrsitie, and I'm the Executive Director of Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. I apologize for being late. I got stuck in traffic a little bit. But CCJRC was actually formed in 1999. Just a couple of us were sitting around and realized that the prison budget was decimating funding for education. Is sort of where our awareness came into focus. I always say it's not that we don't have enough dollars. Maybe it is partly that we don't have enough dollars, but it's also about how we spend the dollars that we do have, and trying to look kind of critically at that. And at the time, I was approached by my senator at the time, Dorothy Rupert, and she said, "Chris, you know," she was an educator, and she said, "My entire tenure at the legislature, all we've done is build prisons," because she was in that period that Senator Steadman spoke of. In 1985, just to put some numbers to it, there was that one bill that passed that he mentioned, the Milky bill, that doubled the maximum sentences for all felonies. And we went back, and because this was before our time, and so we went back and listened to the tapes of the hearings, and it was kind of obscure in terms of what people thought this would cost. You know, there was no fiscal impact assessed. You know, that this was just, we were going to have public safety because we were going to lock up bad people for a longer period of time, and it was really fairly shallow. And this connects back to, I think, the opportunity that the CCJJ brings to the table is that kind of debate would have to get a whole lot deeper and more thoughtful through that kind of a process than just a bill that somebody wants to build a political career on. But the prison population doubled in 5 years. It doubled again in the preceding 10 years. So we saw this explosive growth in the prison population. And with that came an explosive growth in the budget. And what Senator Rupert was saying to me was, every year I've been down here, we've been taking money out of K-12, I think was really the budget that was most vulnerable. And it was rated and rated and rated to build prisons, to operate prisons. We had prisoners that were being transferred out of state because we literally couldn't build prisons fast enough. So we shipped people to Minnesota. We shipped people to Texas. Just trying to cope. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of the Department of Corrections culture at that time was, if you were to go on their website, their motto was not promoting public safety through blah, blah, blah. It was coping with explosive growth. That's what they were doing. They were trying to cope as best they could, because this had there was so little planning and anticipation of what the impact of that one bill would do. And then there were bills on top of that, because it really was the Get Tough on Crime movement. So then after the passage of Amendment 23, which I don't know if a lot of folks understand, that the motivation behind that, talking to education advocates, was a desperate attempt to try to protect funding for K-12, right? And it was because for the preceding decade, funding for K-12 education had not kept pace with inflation, right? So it was seen as a desperate measure to try and put some constitutional restrictions or requirements on funding. I can't speak to the budget stuff. Senator Steadman is the expert on all of that. And once that passed, then the budget because the Department of Corrections budget was continuing to grow and grow and grow and grow, then the budget that became the most vulnerable was higher ed. And that is really the budget at this point in time that we balance the state budget on. We sort of say we're going to spend all of our money here, and whatever is left over, then higher ed gets. And that's getting smaller and smaller, and you're seeing a university system that's struggling with, maybe they have to privatize, maybe they have, how are they going to survive as the principal strategy has been to increase tuition, to cut financial aid, to do these kinds of things to move forward. And so I think on some levels in 2007, January, am I oversimplifying?
No, now you're giving my speech.
Oh, you see, we hang out with each other a lot. But in 2007, Governor Ritter did something that I think was a turning point or a game changer, really was. And maybe it's the Nixon to China moment, where you have a prosecutor who is elected governor who comes in and says, reducing recidivism is going to be a priority of my administration. And that opened the door to a whole different kind of conversation. Because we weren't talking about tough on crime or soft on crime. We were talking about practical, achievable outcomes that you could define and you could measure, right? You can't measure soft, you can't measure tough. All you can do is accuse, right? But you can measure things like reducing recidivism, right? And so it got people having to focus more in terms of research-based, data-driven. There's a lot of junk that gets thrown around in conversations around criminal justice. But people had to get real about what works and what doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, we have to be willing to reevaluate and redesign, right? And so that's what I gave Governor Ritter an enormous amount of credit for, because he didn't necessarily, he put the ball in motion, which then led to the legislation for creating the commission, which, as Senator Steadman has talked about, has really created an entirely different process by which criminal justice policy is debated and designed and evaluated. And I won't repeat it. The one thing that I can say is that in the last 18 months, our prison population has declined by over almost 1,400 people.
What percentage is that?
3.5, John, I'm gonna guess.
4%.
Yeah, I have the data in my bag behind me. I can give you the exact numbers, but that's gonna be my guess. But the trend is looking like this is a new trend, not a blip or an aberration or the effect of one little thing. That you're starting to see what Senator Steadman was talking about in terms of some of these incremental steps that have a cumulative effect. And so, for example, there's been a lot of energy placed on reducing the number of people that go to prison for what's known as a technical violation of supervision. So if you're on probation or you're on parole, you have a lot of conditions that you have to comply with. If you violate a condition like have a job or meet with your supervising agent X number of times a month or whatever, curfews, drug tests, all those kinds of going to drug classes or other classes, if you violate any of a condition, it's called a technical violation. And you can go to prison for that, right? Even though it's not a crime, it's enough of a violation of a condition that you can be on probation, resentenced to prison, or on parole, you're just picked up and you can be revoked on parole and go back to prison. And so we started to look at this because, believe it or not, this is the #1 driver of admissions into prison, which is phenomenally boring and nuanced. When you think it's violent crime, or you think it's this, or you think it's that, it's where the system grinds and grinds and grinds. And when it's not working well or as well as it could, it costs a whole lot of money, right? And so people started both in probation and parole, community corrections a little bit, to really say, what's going on here? And what you end up having to unravel is the fact that most of the people that end up in the criminal justice system are very poor. And once you have a criminal conviction, it can be very difficult to find a job. Or keep a job, right? Because you have to do a lot of requirements while you're under supervision. Well, to be successful in the criminal justice system, you have to have some money. Because all of this stuff costs, right? Classes and UAs and all of these things can be very expensive. And so you started to see people who were essentially giving up, bailing out, because they couldn't afford all of the conditions, and they figured they were going to get in trouble anyway, or maybe I'll just abscond and they can find me 6 months from now, I'll be in Florida, or whatever. But there were these ways where it's a little jargony to say setting people up to fail, because I do think it's really important that people are held accountable for their behavior. But we also have to be really mindful about, why are we asking people to do things? Are we do we want them to do all these things because there's a benefit either to themselves or the public? Or are we just loading a whole bunch of stuff onto people that evidence indicates that makes no bit of difference in terms of either promoting public safety or changing their behavior? But it just racks up all of these additional responsibilities. So that's the kind of very in-the-weeds nuances that a lot of these supervising agencies starting to look and say, wow, we're not following evidence-based practice. We don't have enough resources, and this is where Senator Steadman's work is having such an impact in real people's lives in real time. Because one of the things that he's been able to do with this drug sentencing reform bill is took cost savings in corrections, in the Department of Corrections budget, and reinvested it into substance abuse and mental health treatment. Because if there's two drivers, and this is where CCJRC focuses pretty much exclusively in our work, is on drug policy, because a drug conviction is still the #1 crime for which people go to prison. But it's also a lot more nuanced than that, because you have a lot of people that have underdiagnosed or undertreated substance abuse and mental health issues that end up in the system and then aren't successful in the system because they don't have the capacity to access affordable treatment. And so then they fail when they go to prison. Well, they don't get treatment in prison either, for the most part, because we don't fund the treatment side of it. So then they spend whatever time they're going to spend in prison, and then they come out, and they still have substance abuse issues and mental health issues, and that we're still not accessing treatment services for. So it's just this ridiculous waste of money and human life and human potential, right? And so this shift, there were two bills that I think you were involved in, Bill 1360 and House Bill 1352 in 2010, that said, look, we need to fund services that we know are drivers, A, of instability in this person's life or even criminal behavior in this person's life, that we get more public safety bang and they get more of their life back, right, if we invest in treatment services and mental health services, so that they're successful. Because this is a system that spends an awful lot of money on people's failures, but it's not very balanced in terms of opportunities for success. And I think that's sort of what we're trying to rebalance this system a little bit, that it's not a four-letter word to help people who are in the criminal justice system. We can be, and the other thing that I think has been a fascinating conversation is, are we incarcerating somebody because we're scared of them? Or are we incarcerating somebody because we're just mad at them? Right? We're frustrated because they're not compliant, you know what I mean? And having to have different conversations about how we use prison cells, when we use them, for how long, what happens when people come out. I mean, during this whole 20 generation, really, of lock them up, very, very little thought was placed on, well, what happens when they come out? Because what is fairly clear is almost as many people come out every year as you're putting in. And now we finally have a reverse of that trend. But people weren't thinking about the 10,000, we're not talking a couple hundred people. Just from the state prison system, 10,000 people are released from prison a year. And about 55–60% of them are unemployed when they're on parole, right? And so we know that the research indicates that access to employment and being employed is the single most decisive factor in recidivism reduction and whether somebody's going to be successful and productive and you know, take care of their families and do all of the things that a lot of people really dream about when they're in prison. When they come out, they want, you know, the majority of people that I've known, and I've known a lot of people in my life that have spent time, they want a life out here. You know what I mean? Prison isn't fun. You know, it's not.
I mean, the other thing about having a job and having income for people coming out of prison is back to the point Chrsitie was making about these conditions of parole supervision. You're going to go to drug classes. You're going to have urine analysis screening to see if you're using. You may have to go to sex offender classes or domestic violence classes. And there's a fee that's paid every time they go to these things. And if they don't go, they're violating their conditions and they can end up having their parole revoked. And so having a job not only keeps them out of trouble, it also keeps them on that path to successful reintegration by making them comply with, you know, drug screening and drug treatment classes or anger management or domestic violence or whatever other sorts of things this particular person's been required to do as part of their parole.
What did you say the rate of unemployment was among this?
Well, for folks newly released, so the folks that are still on ISP, it's over 60%.
So
they're within
still
generally the first 6 months of release.
To talk about that issue a little
Yeah,
bit
because but in general, for people on parole, so this isn't a statistic for just somebody that with a criminal background, which is harder to kind of tease out, but nonetheless is a huge issue for a lot of people. But for parolees, it's about 50%, just in general. In general, because it's really
try to keep a job.
well, they say you can survive prison, but you might not survive the felony. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, well, yeah, there are a lot of people who, because the barriers to employment, it was about, I think there was a big change, at least from the research that I've read, that after 9/11, one of the fundamental things that changed in our society and our culture was that employers started to do criminal background checks much more readily. And it's now to the point where 80% of employers, and this could be small employers, but to major corporations, to public sector employers are doing background checks as a matter of routine, as a condition of hire. It's turned out in several different ways. One way is that it's on the application itself. Have you ever been? Some of it says convicted of a felony, some of it says arrested for a crime, so the language can be different. But the bottom line is they're asking about a criminal history. And the problem is that it's often used as a screening tool, right? So you check the box, and it's called, there's campaigns around the country, including here, called Ban the Box, which isn't saying you can't ask somebody about their criminal history, it's just when and how do you use that information. But to use it as just a straight screening tool, there's some online applications when you come to that question, if you answer yes, it's a checkbox, you have no opportunity to put any explanation in, it kicks you out. So you can't even, you have to lie to even get, but you can't lie because you know if you are, they're gonna do a paper background check.
And then you're out
So-
in July.
And then you're out, so if they hire you and then do it, then you're gonna get fired. So it's this really, significant struggle that can be 20, 30 years beyond when you've completed all your court involvement. So it's significant. The Bureau of Justice Statistics released a report that said about 30% of the American population, adult population, has some form of criminal record. So that could be, so we've been a very busy group.
Let me talk about 3052 for a
Yeah,
minute.
please.
So in 2010, as I mentioned, I carried this bill with Representative Mark Waller, a Republican from Colorado Springs. I'm a Denver Democrat. Senator Sean Mitchell was also a sponsor of the bill. He's a Republican from Broomfield. We carried a bill that changed sentencing on drug offenses, minor offenses, the lowest level use, and we changed some of the quantities on the levels of felony, how many grams of a substance do you have to have before you're into the 16 years in prison range. I'm exaggerating a little, but not a lot. We made some very, very small changes around the edges that we all acknowledged was a first step. And we took, a lot of us wanted to go further. I wanted to push a lot further, but we couldn't get consensus at the level of having the police and the sheriffs and the prosecutors and everybody else at the table on going too fast or going too far. And in hindsight, I'm really glad that that was what they decided, because one of their big concerns was if we start diverting a lot of people away from something that would land them in prison and instead create a situation where they're probably going to be sentenced to probation, and a condition of their probation is going to be drug treatment and drug screening. The law enforcement community was very worried about the capacity of the treatment system to absorb that many new people being referred into the system. And in hindsight, I think they're right. And I think going slow has built capacity. And I think, if you know somebody that's looking for a growth industry and a new career to go into, drug treatment is a growth industry in our state. We are investing more money into it. And rightly so, because there were a lot of untreated problems that weren't, there wasn't funding, there wasn't hope. So we made some small changes. But even though they were small changes in the law, our fiscal projections that we do on these bills now said that over the course of the first 5 years, it was going to ramp up, but it was going to ramp up to, after 5 years, we will need to spend cumulatively over 5 years, $55 million less in the prison system. And in terms of that bill, shifted all those dollars over into the substance abuse system. And so the dollars are following the offenders into community placements on probation. Some maybe direct sentence to community corrections, but a lot of these folks are just getting sentenced to probation for first-time offenders, low-level drug crimes. I'm not talking about drug dealers. I'm talking about people who are using, people who are in possession of small amounts. That's a huge shift. And I think easing into it, and this is now, we're going to go into our 2.5 years of it now. We're talking about it in the budget process right now at the budget committee. And we've been increasing the investment that's available in these funds. And I know there's a lot of people that today are still in our community, hopefully still able to keep a job, hopefully, paying their child support or feeding their families or being responsible for the things that they're responsible for, and not a drain on our prison system by sitting in a prison cell when addiction is really the problem here. The next year, we passed a bill that created a presumption of parole for people who had been sentenced under the old laws and were in prison at that point, but had they been sentenced under the new law, wouldn't have gone to prison. And so we tried to move some people out of prison and save more money and give them a presumption that they should be paroled and get them accelerated through the parole board process. And we also passed another bill that changed the use of habitual offender sentencing, which is where it's kind of the 3 strikes you're out kind of sentencing laws, so that it didn't apply to low-level drug offenders. And if you think about it, if somebody has an addiction problem, are we really surprised that they've been busted for possession 3 times? Is that really shocking? And so should their sentence be tripled on the 3rd time because it's a 3rd offense, when the real issue here is untreated drug addiction? That's a waste of tax money, it's a waste of prison cells, it's a waste of lives. Easing up on some of those really harsh sentences, and again, directing resources into treatment and directing people to where they can get the treatment is a much smarter and proven strategy. And so when I talk about, we've carried a series of bills that sort of build upon this new philosophy we want to use for drug offenders in the system. This year, I'm sponsoring a bill, it's Senate Bill 104, it's on your list, Chrsitie, that actually wants to step back and look at all these resources that we've created, because we've actually now created 3 different ways that we fund community-based drug treatment for offenders. There was actually a sentencing reform bill that Senator Ken Gordon, who used to represent this area, he passed in 2003, and it created a pot of money worth about $3 million a year in savings on drug sentencing that he did back in 2003. That money there's a whole board of people that sit around and allocate that $3 million across all the county jails and judicial districts in the state. We also have what's called the drug offender surcharge, which is anyone that's convicted of a drug offense pays, in addition to, if they're going to prison or if they pay a fine, there's a surcharge they also have to pay that goes into a fund. That fund was created to have public funding for treatment for people who couldn't afford it. And that monies are allocated through the judicial system in a different mechanism with a different group of people, sending it to basically the same place as Senator Gordon's savings. And then House Bill 1352, the bill we did in 2010, that saves $55 million over the next 5 years, it had a 3rd mechanism for how those monies got out to the community to provide drug treatment. Senate Bill 104, the bill I'm carrying this year, puts all 3 of those different funding sources into one pot of money, eliminates a lot of the bureaucracy that's built up around the 3 different funding systems, and creates a much more simplified way to get the money to the communities across the state to provide that treatment. And it also has built into it some data collection and accountability measures, so that we're going to start being, we're trying to be data-driven and use what's proven to work. We're going to start better data collection back on all of these resources that we've redirected into community treatment, so that we can prove this is working. The evidence from other states, everything, common sense, all tells you this should work, but we've never really collected the data to sort of track people and see, for those that we're investing and providing these resources for treatment, are we not seeing them as frequent flyers in our criminal justice system? Are we not seeing them with their 3rd possession offense that would have used to have gotten them sentenced under the habitual offender laws? Are we making a dent in the problem? Are we changing outcomes and changing lives? And I think having that data and accountability for the system is going to be really important, because what we've done so far, what Senator Gordon did 9 years ago and what the bill that I carried 2 years ago, we've still just begun to really start chipping away at the total population of drug offenders, because there are a lot of people that may have had more grams of something in their pocket than is going to benefit from the modest changes we've made so far. If you're a heavy drug user, should we really look at you that differently if you had, more or less than 2 grams of cocaine? If you've got a kilo, we've got a drug kingpin and a dealer. That's a different situation. But a heavy user may have over that threshold of quantity that bumps them up. And again, addiction is what's really going on here. Let's not use the fact that it weighed more than 2 grams or more than 4 grams as the determinant. There are also people that we know are involved in the illegal drug trade, people that are drug dealers, that are really in the business to fuel their own habits. They're addicts, and they're selling small quantities, and they're at the very bottom of the distribution chain, and there's big drug kingpins somewhere up above them that really prey upon them as people who will do their work at the street level because they're feeding their own habits in the process of being involved in this illegal drug trade. I think those folks, again, are a population where addiction is really the issue, and even though their crime is a little more serious than just use and possession, if we can get in and treat their addiction, can we get them out of the system as well, get them out of the business that they're in, and get them out of the criminal justice system where they're a drain on taxpayers by occupying a prison cell. These are the kind of reforms that we're building towards, and it's going to be a long time to get there. And the data that we're going to collect back now on this consolidated funding source, I think is going to build the case for continuing to stay the course and keep embarking down this road of trying to use community-based treatment as the correct intervention for more of this drug offending population. And I like to tell this story because I think this is a really good example. I told the other story to tell you that our state legislature is functional and we do things in a bipartisan, logical, rational way. The other reason I like to tell this part of the story is to explain that the process of legislating and making these kinds of changes is really one of lots of small incremental steps. It's really rare that the legislature passes a big, bold reform package. But more often, there's a course we want to be on, and we, over a series of years, will pass a number of pieces of legislation that build upon one another and take us step by step down that path. And I think this is a really good example of the legislative process, in my mind, how it's designed to work and works best. One other thing about the legislative process, to go back to Chrsitie, that Milky bill that she talked about, Don Milky was a state representative from Jefferson County, I believe, used to be the district attorney. The Milky bill passed in 1985. The legislature has completely reformed a number of its processes because of what the legislature as an institution learned from the Milky bill. We now require any bill that sentences someone to prison or has the potential to have a prison sentence to carry 5 years worth of capital appropriations to build a prison cell for the people that bill's going to send to prison. That wasn't a requirement back in Don Milky's day. We also have a much more stringent fiscal note process of really projecting costs or expenditures or savings on legislation that really didn't exist in a very robust way back in Don Milky's day. So the legislature learned a lot from that experience, but taxpayers also paid a lot, and we built a lot of prisons. And we're now in a situation of declining prison populations, where last year the Budget Committee voted to close one of our state prisons. And we all, I think, realize that soon, maybe not this year, maybe next year, maybe the year after, we're probably going to be in a situation if looking at maybe mothballing another one of our prisons. And yet, because of what happened in the 80s and 90s, we were ramping up and building and building. So, I just want you all to know that I think your legislature, from my perspective as a humble public servant, works really well and is able to do some things that make a lot of sense. And we really are pretty mindful of how we're spending your taxpayer dollars in ways that we hope are smart and we hope will preserve public safety. Nobody wants to do this in a rash way that puts the public at risk because we're letting criminals loose or something. But I think we can be a lot smarter, and slowly but surely we're on the course to do that.